Let me tell you a story that begins not with clashing swords or burning fleets, but with something far more unexpected, a golden apple. This wasn't just any fruit, but one tossed casually into a wedding feast, setting in motion events that would echo through eternity. We're stepping into a world where gods walk among mortals, where kings are bound by sacred oaths, and where a single choice can ignite a decade of bloodshed. This isn't the Greece of marble temples and philosophers you might imagine. Not yet. We're in the mythic age, wilder, stranger, when heroes cast longer shadows and deities meddled in every human step. If tales like this help you unwind, feel free to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if it genuinely helps you breathe a little easier. Drop a comment about where you're listening from and what time it is right now. There's something comforting about knowing we're all drifting through these ancient stories together. So get comfortable. Let history unfold at its own pace as we begin with the spark that set the Trojan War ablaze. Our story starts not with bloodshed, but with what should have been a joyous occasion, the wedding of Peleus, a mortal king, to Thetis, a sea nymph of breathtaking beauty and unpredictable moods. One day she's calming waves. The next, she's breathing fire like some aquatic dragon. Typical sea nymph behavior, slippery in every sense. This was no ordinary wedding. The guest list included Zeus himself, along with Hera, Athena, Apollo, and Dionysus, who undoubtedly came for the wine and stayed for the drama. There was a prophecy hanging over this union, that Thetis' child would surpass his father. The gods, being the ultimate power-hungry bureaucrats, decided none of them fancied raising a potential usurper. Solution? Marry her off to a mortal. Enter Peleus, a decent enough warrior who probably didn't ask too many questions. Now here's where things turn from celebration to catastrophe. Someone didn't get an invitation. That someone was Eris, goddess of discord. Basically the ancient equivalent of that one friend who ruins every group chat. Snubbed and seething, she crashed the party anyway, bringing a gift, a golden apple inscribed with 3 dangerous words, to the fairest. She tossed it into the hall and watched as the room fell silent, likely leaving with the smirk of someone who's just thrown a grenade into polite society. You'd think gods would be above squabbling over fruit, but no. Dignity left faster than Hermes on an errand. 3 goddesses immediately claimed it. Hera the queen, Athena of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite of love, who specialized in complicating everything. Each believed herself the rightful owner, and each was terrifying enough to make the others reconsider. Faced with this divine beauty pageant, the gods did what bureaucracies always do with no-win scenarios. They passed the buck. Enter Paris, Prince of Troy, a man whose future decisions would prove judgment wasn't his strong suit. At this moment, though, he was just a shepherd on Mount Ida, having been exiled due to a prophecy that he'd destroy Troy. His family's solution? Abandon him as a baby, just in case. He grew up handsome, but utterly unprepared to judge a divine competition. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris in full radiant glory, each offering a bribe. Hera promised power over Asia. Athena offered wisdom and victory, but Aphrodite knew her audience. She promised the love of the world's most beautiful woman. Paris, thinking with the logic of a hormone-driven young man rather than a strategist, handed the apple to Aphrodite. And with that choice, the world began its slow burn toward war. Now, about this most beautiful woman. Her name was Helen, Queen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus, who'd seduced her mother Leto while disguised as a swan, because Greek mythology. She'd been courted by every eligible king in Greece, nearly causing wars before her mortal father Tyndareus made all suitors swear an oath. They'd respect Helen's choice, and if anyone took her, they'd all band together to bring her back. An early example of what we might call a collective security nightmare. Helen chose Menelaus, capable if unremarkable king of Sparta. For a time, peace held, until Paris arrived on a diplomatic mission and, with Aphrodite's encouragement, either seduced or abducted Helen. Sources differ. In Homer's version, Helen seems regretful. In Euripides', more assertive. Some later poets claimed Helen never went to Troy at all, just a phantom version, while the real Helen waited out the war in Egypt, utterly confused. Regardless of version, the result was the same. Paris sailed home with Helen, Menelaus invoked the oath, and suddenly every Greek king who'd ever courted Helen was honor-bound to fight. This is where myth meets history. Scholars still debate whether the Trojan War actually happened. Archaeological digs at Hazarlik, believed to be Troy's site, show a city destroyed multiple times by war. Trade routes, riches, conflicts. Someone was definitely fighting over something. Back to myth. The Greeks assembled under Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother, not because he was beloved, he wasn't, but because he had the most ships and the loudest voice. Other kings answered, crafty Odysseus, long-winded Nestor, strong silent Ajax, and most famously Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, the very couple whose wedding started this mess. Achilles, raised by the centaur Chiron, was destined to be Greece's greatest warrior. His mother Thetis, trying to cheat fate, dipped him in the river Styx for invulnerability, except for the heel she held him by, giving us the term Achilles' heel. Not all heroes were eager to join. Odysseus feigned madness to avoid leaving his infant son, plowing his fields with salt until they placed baby Telemachus in front of his plow. Achilles was hidden disguised as a girl among King Lycomedes's daughters until Odysseus laid out gifts. The girls went for combs and mirrors. Achilles instinctively grabbed the sword. So the ships gathered, 1,000 strong by legend, at Aulis, where the winds refused to blow. Why? Because Agamemnon had offended Artemis, likely by boasting or killing her sacred deer. Her price? The sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia, a moment where Greek myth takes its darkest turn. Agamemnon hesitated, but ambition won. Iphigenia was lured under pretense of marrying Achilles, then sacrificed, though some versions say Artemis substituted a deer at the last moment. The winds returned, and the fleet set sail, a grim beginning to a grimmer war, with divine grudges, broken oaths, and personal tragedies mounting. The 1,000 ships embarked on what would become a decade-long conflict that would leave most participants dead, disgraced, or eternally wandering. But that's a tale for later. For now, remember, history's greatest war began not with a sword, but with a wedding, an insult, and one golden apple. Now let's shift our gaze from divine apples and quarreling goddesses to the woman who supposedly launched 1,000 ships. That might be poetic exaggeration, but Helen of Sparta, later of Troy, stood unquestionably at the storm's eye. Her story begins before birth, which in mythology always spells trouble. Her mother Leda, queen of Sparta, caught Zeus's ever-wandering eye. But rather than appearing in his usual radiant form, the king of gods transformed into a swan, because divine logic, resulting in either an egg or several. Myths aren't fussy about plausibility. From these hatched Helen, sometimes alongside her siblings Castor, Pollux, and Clytemnestra, will become important when things unravel back in Greece. Raised in royal luxury, Helen was beauty incarnate, not just attractive, but divinely, catastrophically gorgeous. The kind that made men sigh foolishly, women whisper warnings, and kings forget basic decency. As she came of age, suitors flocked like moths to flame. Every eligible Greek prince and warrior, including Odysseus, Ajax, and Menelaus. The competition grew so fierce her mortal father Tyndareus feared choosing any suitor would spark immediate war. Enter Odysseus the tactician, suggesting all suitors swear the oath of Tyndareus. They'd honor Helen's choice and collectively defend her marriage. A clever solution destined, like most clever solutions in Greek myth, to backfire spectacularly. Helen chose Menelaus, brother to Agamemnon and future Spartan king. Competent, wealthy, about as charming as polished armor, but respectable. They married, had a daughter Hermione, and ruled peacefully until Paris arrived. Paris, Trojan prince raised as a shepherd due to that pesky "he'll destroy Troy" prophecy. His parents' solution? Classic abandonment. Reinstated later, he was sent to Sparta on diplomatic business. officially for friendly relations, unofficially to stir the plot. Menelaus played gracious host, meaning he didn't stab anyone immediately, then left for a funeral. Paris, aided by Aphrodite's promise, either seduced or abducted Helen, sources still bicker. Homer's Helen seems remorseful. Euripides gives her more agency. Some versions claim only a phantom Helen went to Troy while the real one vacationed in Egypt, baffled. Regardless, Paris sailed home with Helen, triggering the Oath of Tyndareus. Messengers raced across Greece summoning every bound king, even those who'd moved on. Agamemnon took command. He had the ships. Odysseus tried dodging by pretending madness, plowing fields with salt, until they tested him with baby Telemachus. Achilles was hiding disguised as a girl, thanks to Mom Thetis fearing his prophesied death, until Odysseus laid out gifts. The girls chose combs. Achilles grabbed the sword. So the fleet assembled at Aulis. Legend says 1,000 ships, where the winds refused to blow. Why? Agamemnon had offended Artemis, killed her sacred deer, or boasted, take your pick. Her price? His daughter Iphigenia. After horrific deliberation, he sacrificed her, or a deer substitute, depending on version. The winds came, and the fleet embarked. Their first stop? Not Troy. They accidentally attacked friendly Tithrania, ancient GPS failure, then finally reached Troy's shores where the Trojans watched black sails fill the horizon. Archaeologists believe Troy, modern Hazarlik, was a real Bronze Age city destroyed multiple times, layers of fire and war matching Homer's descriptions. Inside those legendary walls, built by Apollo and Poseidon during their indentured servitude to King Laomedon, King Priam ruled wearily with sharp-tongued Hecuba. Their son Hector, Troy's noble defender, fought for family, not glory. Paris? Beautiful, irresponsible, and now hosting Helen in the palace, admired by some, blamed by others. Helen herself lived in limbo, both queen and prisoner, aware of the whispers. For 9 years, the Greeks couldn't breach Troy's walls, resorting to raiding allies. During one raid, they captured 2 women who'd ignite disaster. Chryseis, given to Agamemnon, and Briseis to Achilles. When Chryseis's priest father begged for her return and Agamemnon refused, Apollo sent plague. Forced to return Chryseis, Agamemnon took Briseis from Achilles as compensation, violating warrior code. Achilles withdrew from battle, brooding in his tent as Greeks died without him. The Trojans, led by Hector, pushed to the Greek ships. Desperate, Agamemnon offered treasures to lure Achilles back, even returning untouched Briseis, but Achilles refused, questioning the war's very point. His friend Patroclus then donned Achilles' armor to rally Greeks, forgetting Achilles' warning not to attack Troy directly. Hector killed him, thinking he fought Achilles, and took the armor. When Achilles heard, his grief ignited into world-shaking rage, but that's the next chapter. When people imagine the Trojan War, they often picture non-stop heroic clashes, bronze flashing under Mediterranean sun, gods hurling thunderbolts from Olympus, warriors shouting epithets mid-battle. But the brutal truth? Most of those 9 grinding years resembled less an epic poem and more a miserable military stalemate. Think trench warfare without the trenches, just endless raids, supply shortages, and the creeping realization that nobody remembered why they were fighting anymore. The Greek camp sprawled along Troy's shoreline like a particularly ill-planned festival, all makeshift huts, beached ships, and the ever-present stench of too many unwashed warriors in one place. Their initial battle plans had assumed Troy would fall quickly, maybe a summer campaign, tops. Instead, they found themselves staring at those damn impregnable walls, courtesy of Apollo and Poseidon's contractual masonry work, while conducting increasingly desperate raids on surrounding villages. These weren't glorious battles, but brutal scavenger hunts, seizing grain stores, stealing livestock, and yes, taking women as spoils. Chryseis and Briseis entered the story this way, not as characters, but as property traded between men. their fates igniting the conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles we discussed earlier. But the rot went deeper than one quarrel. The Greek coalition, always fragile, began fracturing under Agamemnon's tone-deaf leadership. The man had a gift for taking the lion's share of plunder while distributing blame equally. Odysseus, Diomedes, even old Nestor, they all grew weary of his leadership by tantrum style. Meanwhile, Achilles sat in his tent like the world's most dangerous sulking teenager, polishing his weapons and composing increasingly bitter folk songs about betrayal. His absence created a power vacuum that Hector, Troy's crown prince, exploited masterfully. Hector, the one truly noble figure in this mess. While Paris preened and Priam fretted, Hector organized defenses, boosted morale, and fought not for glory, but because it was his duty. The Iliad gives us heartbreaking glimpses of his domestic life, playing with his toddler son Astyanax, reassuring his wife Andromache, who'd already lost her entire family to Greek raids. This wasn't some invincible demigod, but a good man trapped in a bad war. His clashes with the Greeks became tactical masterclasses, methodically pushing them back toward their ships, exploiting their disunity. The gods, of course, couldn't resist meddling. Athena, pro-Greek, and Apollo, pro-Troy, played chess with human lives, while Aphrodite kept rescuing Paris from consequences, like that time she yoinked him mid-duel with Menelaus. Even Zeus's neutrality meant mostly napping on Olympus until Hera nagged him into action. Their interventions often backfired spectacularly, like when Diomedes, juiced up by Athena's temporary god vision, managed to wound both Aphrodite and Ares in one battle. The war god's subsequent tantrum, whining to Zeus about mortal disrespect, remains one of mythology's most hilariously undignified moments. Amid this divine soap opera, the human cost mounted. Greek raids left Trojan countryside villages smoking ruins. Disease, probably dysentery, periodically ravaged both camps. And always, those unbreachable walls loomed, their shadows stretching longer as years crawled by. Some scholars suggest the archaeological record shows Troy VI's walls were indeed formidable, 5-meter-thick limestone fortifications with strategic sightlines. The Greeks had siege technology roughly equivalent to yell loudly and hope for the best. Then came Patroclus's fatal decision. With Achilles still refusing to fight and Greek morale collapsing, his closest companion, some say lover, donned Achilles' iconic armor, the ultimate psychological weapon. At first, it worked brilliantly. The Trojans panicked, thinking the invincible warrior had returned. But carried by initial success, Patroclus overextended, chasing Hector's forces too close to Troy's walls. What happened next became legend. Hector's spear found its mark, the armor was stripped, a brutal cultural insult. And suddenly Achilles' wrath had a new, terrible focus. When news reached Achilles, his grief manifested physically, rolling in ashes, tearing his hair, howls that made nearby soldiers recoil. This wasn't just anger. It was the sound of a man's moral compass shattering. His mother Thetis rose from the sea depths to commission new armor from Hephaestus. Not just weapons, but a cosmic statement. The shield Hephaestus forged depicted the entire world, cities at peace and war, farmers plowing, dancers twirling under stars, a silent rebuke to Achilles' all-consuming rage. Yet he strapped it on anyway, his transformation into death incarnate complete. What followed wasn't battle but slaughter. Achilles carved through Trojan ranks like a scythe through wheat, stacking corpses so high they dammed the Scamander River. The river god himself rose in protest, nearly drowning Achilles until Hera sent Hephaestus to boil the waters dry. Even the gods grew uneasy at this unchecked fury. And at last, Hector stood alone before Troy's gates, knowing this duel was inevitable, knowing he'd lose, but walking out anyway because that's what princes do. Their clash became the war's spiritual climax, the good soldier versus the broken weapon, duty facing wrath. When Achilles' spear struck true, his subsequent desecration of Hector's body, dragging it behind his chariot for days, crossed a line even the Greeks found disturbing. Yet in a stunning reversal, when broken old Priam crept into the Greek camp to ransom his son's body, something in Achilles cracked open. The two enemies wept together over shared grief, Priam for Hector, Achilles for Patroclus, both for the war's senseless waste. That fragile moment of humanity, more than any battle, reveals Homer's genius. Because wars aren't won by rage, but by remembering what we're fighting for, and when we've forgotten altogether. The fall of Troy was inevitable, not because the Greeks were stronger, but because fate had already written the ending. Yet before the city could burn, the war demanded one last sacrifice, the death of its greatest warrior. Achilles had returned to battle not for Agamemnon, not for glory, but for vengeance. His rage had scorched the Trojan plains, his grief turning the river Scamander red with blood. But even the mightiest heroes are bound by prophecy, and Achilles' fate had been sealed long before he ever set foot on Trojan soil. The gods, ever the puppeteers of mortal lives, had grown uneasy watching his rampage. Apollo, in particular, had seen enough. The sun god had favored Troy from the beginning, and now, as Achilles cut down Trojans like wheat before a scythe, Apollo decided it was time to intervene. But gods rarely act directly. They prefer proxies, subtle nudges, the right arrow at the right moment. Enter Paris. Yes, that Paris, the pretty prince who started this war, the man who had spent most of it avoiding actual combat, the lover, not the fighter. But Apollo whispered in his ear, guiding his hand as he drew back his bow. Some versions say the arrow struck Achilles in the heel, that famous weak spot where his mother Thetis had held him as she dipped him in the Styx. Others claim it was Apollo himself who guided the arrow's flight, ensuring it found its mark regardless of where it landed. Either way, the result was the same. The greatest warrior of the Greek age fell, not in some climactic duel, but to a coward's shot from the shadows. Achilles' death was not the end of the war, but it was the end of its soul. The Greeks, who had relied on his fury to carry them forward, now faced the grim reality of fighting without their champion. His body was retrieved after a brutal struggle, Ajax the Greater holding off the Trojans while Odysseus dragged Achilles' corpse back to the Greek lines. The funeral rites were extravagant, befitting a demigod. His armor, forged by Hephaestus himself, became the subject of a bitter dispute. Ajax, the second greatest Greek warrior, expected to inherit it. He had been Achilles' comrade, his shield brother, the man who had defended his body. But Odysseus, ever the silver-tongued strategist, argued that he deserved it, not for strength, but for cunning, the quality that would ultimately win the war. The Greeks, swayed by Odysseus's words, and perhaps already envisioning the wooden horse scheme, awarded him the armor. Ajax did not take this well. In a fit of wounded pride and madness, he slaughtered a herd of sheep, believing them to be the Greek commanders who had betrayed him. When the haze of rage lifted and he realized what he had done, the shame was unbearable. Ajax, the bulwark of the Greek army, the man who had stood alone against Hector, took his own life with the very sword that had once defended Achilles. His suicide sent shockwaves through the camp, another hero gone, not to enemy spears, but to his own despair. With both Achilles and Ajax dead, the Greeks were left staring at Troy's walls with dwindling hope. The war had dragged on for nearly a decade. Morale was crumbling. The gods had grown weary of the bloodshed. Something had to change. That change came in the form of prophecy. The seer Calchas revealed that Troy would never fall unless three conditions were met. The bow of Heracles had to be brought to Troy. Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, had to join the fight. The Palladium, the sacred statue of Athena, had to be stolen from Troy's temples. Odysseus, ever the problem solver, took charge. First, he sailed to the island of Lemnos to retrieve Philoctetes, the archer who possessed Heracles' bow. Abandoned years earlier due to a festering snake bite, Philoctetes had every reason to hate the Greeks, but Odysseus, with his usual mix of persuasion and deception, convinced him to return. Next, they fetched Neoptolemus, also called Pyrrhus, Achilles' teenage son, a boy raised on stories of his father's glory and eager to prove himself. The final task, stealing the Palladium, was the riskiest. Odysseus and Diomedes snuck into Troy under cover of night, scaling the walls and slipping past guards to snatch the sacred statue. With all three conditions fulfilled, the Greeks finally had their path to victory. But brute force had failed before. This time, they would win with deception. Odysseus's plan was simple, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. Build a giant wooden horse, hide soldiers inside, and trick the Trojans into bringing it into their city. The Greeks pretended to sail away, leaving the horse as an offering to Athena. The Trojans, exhausted by war and desperate to believe it was over, fell for the ruse, despite the warnings of Cassandra, who was cursed never to be believed, and Laocoon, who was promptly eaten by sea serpents for his skepticism. That night, as Troy celebrated its supposed victory, the hidden Greeks crept out of the horse, opened the gates, and unleashed hell. The sack of Troy was not a battle, it was a massacre. The wooden horse stood inside Troy's gates. For the first time in 10 years, the Trojans allowed themselves to believe the war was over. They feasted, drank, celebrated, unaware that the Greeks had not sailed home, but lurked just beyond the horizon, waiting for the signal. And inside the horse's hollow belly, 30 of Greece's deadliest warriors crouched in silence, their swords ready. Midnight came. The city slept, drunk on wine and false security. Then the trap sprang. Odysseus and his men slipped from the horse like shadows, killing the guards at the gates with swift, merciless precision. They threw open the walls, and the Greek army, waiting in the darkness, poured into Troy like a flood. What followed wasn't war. It was slaughter. The Trojans, unprepared and unarmed, died in their homes, in the streets, even at the altars where they begged the gods for mercy. King Priam, old and broken, was butchered at his own hearth by Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, a boy who had grown up hearing of his father's glory and now sought to claim his own in blood. Hector's infant son, Astyanax, was hurled from the walls, ensuring no heir would rise to avenge Troy. The women, Hecuba, Andromache, Cassandra, were dragged away as slaves, their fates already written by the victors. Only a handful escaped. Aeneas, carrying his elderly father Anchises on his back, fled with his young son Ascanius, destined to found a new kingdom far to the west. Helen, whose face had launched this nightmare, was reclaimed by Menelaus, though legends differ on whether he killed her, forgave her, or simply took her back as property. By dawn, Troy was burning. The flames climbed the temples, the palaces, the homes of both the noble and the nameless. The smoke could be seen for miles, a funeral pyre for an entire civilization. The Greeks, who had fought for a decade to see this moment, now stood amid the ruins, their victory tasting strangely hollow. Because the gods do not let sacrilege go unpunished. The Greeks had committed two unforgivable sins in their final assault. The murder of Priam at Zeus's altar, an act of blasphemy that even the pro-Greek gods could not ignore. The rape of Cassandra in Athena's temple. Ajax the Lesser had dragged her from the statue of the goddess, defiling sacred ground. Athena, who had supported the Greeks for 10 years, now turned her fury against them. The journey home became a gauntlet of divine vengeance. Storms wrecked ships, winds blew them off course, and men who had survived a decade of war drowned within sight of their homeland. Agamemnon made it back to Mycenae only to be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus, a bloody end for the man who had sacrificed his own daughter for fair winds. Menelaus and Helen were blown off course, wandering for years before reaching Sparta. And Odysseus? His voyage home would become its own epic, a 10-year odyssey of monsters, witches, and the wrath of Poseidon. But that is another story. For Troy, there would be no rebirth. The city burned to the ground, its people scattered, its name becoming synonymous with tragic downfall. Yet from its ashes rose new legends. Aeneas's journey to Italy, the founding of Rome, the countless tales of survivors carrying fragments of Troy's memory across the ancient world. The war had ended, but its echoes would never fade. The fires of Troy had cooled, but the war's aftermath was just beginning. For the Greeks, victory had come at a cost none could have predicted. The gods, who had once favored their cause, now turned against them with cold precision. The journey home, the Nostos every soldier had dreamed of for 10 long years, became a gauntlet of storms, monsters, and treachery. And for the Trojans who had escaped the slaughter, survival meant becoming refugees in a world that had no mercy for the defeated. Let us follow their fates, one by one. Aeneas, the warrior who had carried his father Anchises on his back while leading his young son Ascanius to safety, became the most famous exile. Virgil's Aeneid would later immortalize his journey, wandering the Mediterranean, battling storms sent by vengeful Juno, descending into the underworld where his dead wife, Creusa, whispered prophecies of a new homeland. After years of struggle, he reached Italy, where his descendants would supposedly found Rome. History may debate the truth of this, but the symbolism was potent. Troy fell, but its legacy rose again in the West. Hecuba, once queen of Troy, became a slave. Captured by Odysseus, she was taken to Thrace, where she discovered her last surviving son Polydorus had been murdered by the local king Polymestor. In Euripides' tragedy, Hecuba takes horrific revenge, luring Polymestor to her tent, where she and other enslaved Trojan women gouge out his eyes and murder his children. The gods transform her into a snarling dog, either as punishment or mercy. Andromache, Hector's widow, was given to Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, as a war prize. She bore him a child, but lived in constant terror for her son Astyanax, only to learn he had already been killed. Later traditions say she married Helenus, Hector's brother, and founded a miniature New Troy in Epirus. Cassandra, the prophetess cursed never to be believed, was taken by Agamemnon to Mycenae. She died with him, murdered by Clytemnestra, her last prophecies ignored even as she smelled the blood of the lion, as she had foretold, in the palace halls. Helen, the woman blamed for it all, returned to Sparta with Menelaus. Some versions claim she lived out her days as a penitent queen. Others say she was worshipped as a goddess in parts of Greece. The poet Stesichorus even claimed a phantom Helen had gone to Troy, while the real one waited innocently in Egypt, a convenient way to absolve her of guilt. Agamemnon sailed home triumphant, only to walk into Clytemnestra's trap. She welcomed him with a purple carpet, an honor fit for a god, his first mistake, and then murdered him in his bath, avenging Iphigenia's sacrifice. His death marked the beginning of the house of Atreus' curse, continuing through generations. Menelaus and Helen endured 7 years of wandering, blown off course to Egypt, Cyprus, and even the edge of the underworld before finally reaching Sparta. There, they resumed their royal lives, though Homer's Odyssey hints at the tension lingering between them. Ajax the Lesser, who had dragged Cassandra from Athena's temple, drowned on the voyage home. Athena herself hurled a thunderbolt at his ship, and Poseidon finished him with a trident strike, divine retribution for sacrilege. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, made it home to Phthia, but was later murdered at Delphi, possibly as revenge for killing Priam at the altar. His ghost reportedly haunted the Greeks for years. Odysseus, of course, faced the longest journey, 10 more years of Cyclopes, Sirens, and Calypso's island before reaching Ithaca. But that is another epic entirely. Troy's fall was not just the end of a city. It marked the close of the heroic age itself. The survivors, both Greek and Trojan, carried fragments of the war's memory into new lands, where the stories mutated, blended, and took root. The Iliad and Odyssey preserved the names of the dead, but countless others vanished into oblivion. Archaeology tells us that Troy Va, the layer most associated with Homer's Troy, did burn around 1180 BCE, a casualty of the late Bronze Age collapse that shattered the Mediterranean world. Whether a real Trojan War happened matters less than what the myth came to represent. The futility of war, the fragility of civilization, and the way stories outlast empires. The Greeks won, but no one truly survived. The smoke over Troy's ruins hadn't even cleared when the survivors realized something bitter. Nobody actually won this war. The Greeks? They hauled their loot back home only to find their kingdoms didn't recognize them anymore. 10 years is a long time. Wives remarried. Kids grew up calling other men dad. Old Nestor's voice got even more grating with all that back in my day rambling. And Odysseus' father Laertes? Poor guy just wandered his vineyard muttering. Should have taught the boy to swim better. As for the Trojans, oh, they had it rough. Aeneas and his crew became the Mediterranean's saddest boat people, drifting around like lost seagulls. One minute they're roasting fish under the Sicilian sun. Next minute some one-eyed giants using their ships as toothpicks. True story. Aeneas once talked their way out of being eaten by yelling, "Wait, we taste terrible." Turns out, Cyclopes hate whiny food. But the nightmares came anyway. His dead wife Creusa kept haunting him with mom advice like, "Don't let Ascanius skip breakfast." And the women? Don't get me started. Andromache got handed to Neoptolemus like a consolation prize. Picture this. Forced to nod while Achilles brags. "My dad could have beaten your husband blindfolded." Meanwhile in Mycenae, Cassandra's screaming prophecies at Agamemnon's laundry, "That purple robe's gonna stain," while everyone ignores her. Again, Helen? Oh, she pulled the ultimate hoopsie-daisy. Swan back to Sparta like, "Darling, I got so lost." Menelaus, being the human equivalent of wet bread, just sighed and built her a bigger closet. Years later, some smart-mouthed bard asked old veterans, "Was it worth it?" The silence lasted so long, they could have planted crops in it. Because war doesn't end when the fighting stops. It lives in the way Hector's son wasn't there to throw rocks at stray dogs. In how Odysseus flinches at campfire smoke for 20 years. In Trojan grandmother's whispering. That's not how the story really went. The gods. They moved on to newer dramas. Zeus hooked up with another nymph. Athena adopted a stray owl. And Aphrodite started a love guru side hustle. Spoiler, still bad at relationships. Only the mortals stayed stuck in the past. Like that one drunk at the tavern still slurring, back at Troy. While everyone slowly edges away. So yeah, Troy burned. Greece won. And the only real lesson? Next time someone offers you a giant wooden horse, just say no. The real tragedy of Troy wasn't the famous deaths. It was the anonymous lives unraveling in the margins. Like the Greek supply clerk who spent a decade counting rotten figs and suddenly had to relearn how to be a father. Or Hector's old stable hand who survived the sack by hiding in a horse trough, only to starve because nobody remembered to feed the last living Trojan horse. Remember that pretty boy Paris? After the war, his ghost kept haunting the ruins, trying to apologize to Helen's phantom until she finally screamed, "For Hades' sake, I wasn't even here," and dematerialized. Even in death, the man couldn't take a hint. Down in the underworld, things got awkward. Achilles and Patroclus set up house in Elysium, throwing dinner parties where Agamemnon always got too drunk and cried about his bad press. Meanwhile in Tartarus, Odysseus kept running into Trojan soldiers he'd personally slaughtered. Now they play backgammon every Thursday and bitched about the awful afterlife catering. The mortal world moved on strangely. That wooden horse blueprint got repurposed for carnival rides, the original Trojan carousel. An enterprising merchant started selling authentic Achilles heel sandals that gave buyers blisters in exactly the right spot. And in a twist the fates didn't see coming, Andromache's memoir How to Survive Your Husband's Killer became a surprise bestseller in Sparta. Years later, archaeologists would sift through Troy's ashes and find a child's clay doll, half melted by fire. No songs were written about her. The war ended, but the ghost stayed. Not the famous ones. Achilles still preened in Elysium. Hector brooded nobly in the afterlife. And Paris kept getting kicked out of underworld bars for hitting on Persephone. No, the real hauntings came from the others. The cooks who'd burned the last meals for boys who'd die at dawn. The merchants who'd sold faulty armor and spent decades wondering which death it caused. The Trojan washerwomen who still scrubbed phantom blood from linen that no longer existed. One particularly stubborn spirit was the Greek army's quartermaster, A man who'd spent 10 years counting spears and now floated around battlefields muttering inventory lists. 12 broken shields, 3 chipped swords, 1 slightly used liver. The living ignored him, but stray dogs would sometimes howl along with his tallies. Down in the markets of what used to be Troy, a new legend sprouted. If you left out a bowl of lentils at midnight, the ghost of Hector's old stable boy would eat them and whisper which alleys to avoid. He died of hunger, but apparently ghosts still crave snacks. Meanwhile, up on Olympus, the gods held a lessons learned symposium that mostly involved Dionysus spilling wine on the minutes. A decade after the war, the most unexpected people were cashing in. A sly merchant in Crete sold authentic Helen hairs, actually just dyed goat wool, to lovesick nobles. Over in Thessaly, a retired soldier opened Achilles' Gym, where men paid to get yelled at while lifting rocks. The secret? He'd never met Achilles, but figured rage was universal. But the weirdest entrepreneur was the Trojan seamstress who'd survived by hiding in a laundry basket. She now ran a booming business stitching I Red Heart Troy tunics for Greek tourists. What, she'd shrug. Their drachma spends the same. Even the gods got in on the action. Hermes started a shady Underworld Express service charging souls extra to skip the line at Judgment. Hera, ironically, sold marriage counseling. The only one not profiting? Poor Odysseus, still lost at sea. While back home, a bard wrote a hit song mocking his bad sense of direction. You know how they never talk about the waiting? That last hour before dawn when you're crouched behind the Greek siege walls, breath fogging in the air, fingers gone numb around your spear. Somewhere out there in the dark, a Trojan scout is pissing against the same olive tree he's used for 3 years straight. You can hear it. Neither of you moves. It's become this weird little ritual, like if you don't acknowledge each other, the war stays impersonal. Funny how your brain fixates on stupid details when death might come at sunrise. That crack in your left sandal. The way Ajax always hums off-key during watch. The blister on your palm from sharpening the same sword for the 1000th time. You try not to think about home because, thunk, a single arrow embeds itself in the dirt by your foot. Not an attack, just old Priam's archers testing range again. You sigh and flick it away with your toe. Some new recruit down the line gasps like the sky's falling. Relax, you mutter. They always miss this one spot at dawn. Sun's in their eyes. That's when it hits you. You've memorized their misses. Over in Troy, Hector's wife Andromache is doing her own waiting. She's counting the cracks in the ceiling, 11 now, while baby Astyanax snores against her shoulder. The nursery rhymes she sings are battle hymns with the words changed. You'd laugh if you heard them. So would Hector, before his face goes tight with guilt. She hates that she knows exactly how many steps it is to the secret tunnel under the palace, 73. Hates that she started eyeing the serving girls, wondering which one she'll have to sacrifice first if the walls fall. Most of all, hates that when Hector comes home smelling of blood and sweat, her first thought isn't, thank the gods you're safe, but your beard's gotten patchier. Are you stressed? Will that affect your fighting? Love in wartime becomes a series of tactical assessments. Up on Olympus, Aphrodite's filing her nails while Ares tries to flirt. Admit it, he grins. You love how I make battlefields romantic. She rolls her eyes so hard Hermes chokes on his ambrosia. Meanwhile, down in the dirt, you're digging a splinter out of your thumb and trying not to wonder. If you die today, will they at least burn your body facing west? Your village is that way. Your dog probably doesn't remember you. Your little sister might be married by now. Clang. Breakfast call. The Trojan scout finishes his business. Somewhere, a baker's daughter is kneading dough without realizing it's the last morning she'll ever do it. And the war, always the war, grinds on. You never get used to the silence after the screaming stops. That hour when the last groans fade and the crows descend, black wings rustling like priests counting coins. Your ears still ring from the battle cries, but now there's just the drip of someone's life leaking into Trojan soil. You sit there with your back against a broken shield, chewing stale bread like it's the sacrament of the damned. Funny how you notice things then, like how the boy from Corinth, the one who always bragged about his first kill, is now methodically wiping his sword with a cloth that used to be his mother's veil. Or how Ajax the Lesser keeps readying his sandal, even though the strap isn't loose. Just something to do with hands that won't stop shaking. Across the field, a Trojan prisoner vomits up blood and what might have been his last meal. Nobody moves to help. You recognize his armor. That dented left shoulder plate means he's one of Hector's men. For a wild second, you consider offering him your water skin. Then you remember your cousin's body being dragged behind Trojan chariots last winter. The moment passes. In Troy, Helen is unraveling. Not dramatically, not like the poets will later sing. Just small unravelings. A missed stitch in her embroidery, forgetting which side Menelaus likes his olives on. She stands at the loom, fingers trembling as she weaves the same battle scene over and over. Click-clack, click-clack. The servants whisper she's making a shroud, but the truth is worse. She doesn't know what she's making anymore. Paris finds her like this at midnight. "Come to bed," he says, hand on her waist like he's still the golden prince who stole her. She lets him lead her away, but her eyes stay fixed on that half-woven image of Achilles dragging Hector's corpse. A question hangs between them, thick as the palace smoke. Was any of this worth it? Neither dares answer. Back in the Greek camp, Odysseus is carving notches into his arm, not tally marks. He gave up counting dead Trojans years ago. These are symbols even he doesn't understand. Maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. The firelight makes his shadow loom against the tents, and for once, the man of twists and turns looks tired, just tired. A scout brings news of Trojan reinforcements. Odysseus nods, rubs the fresh cuts, and starts spinning lies about tomorrow's battle plan. Somewhere beyond the campfires, a horse whinnies like it's laughing at them all. You know what nobody tells you about war? How boring it gets between the terror. Those long afternoons when the sun bakes the stench of unwashed men and rotting horse carcasses into your skin. You're playing dice with your tent mate, the one who snores like a dying boar, and suddenly realize you've memorized exactly how his left eyebrow twitches when he's about to cheat. Again, stop glaring, he grumbles, palming the good dice. It's not my fault the fates hate you. You should report him. You won't. These days, the only justice comes in wine jugs and the occasional fist fight behind the latrines. Meanwhile, in Troy's lower city, a baker's daughter is doing something reckless. She's been sneaking out at night to meet a Greek deserter, some farm boy from Ithaca who claims he just wants to talk. Stupid, dangerous. But when he presses a fig into her hand, still warm from his pocket, she forgets to care. They sit shoulder to shoulder in the olive grove, not touching, while he teaches her filthy phrases in Greek. Say, oinops pontos, he whispers. Wine dark sea, she repeats, rolling the words like honey on her tongue. Neither mentions that come dawn, he'll be back to killing her cousins. Some silences are kinder than the truth. Up on the walls, Paris is having another existential crisis. He leans over the battlements, watching the Greek campfires flicker like mocking stars. His breath comes too fast. That's new. Used to be, he could charm his way out of anything. A quick smile, a well-timed compliment. But tonight, even Aphrodite's whispers sound tinny and far away. You're Paris, she purred earlier. The golden prince. The lover, not the fighter. Then why does his reflection keep morphing into Hector's face? A sentry coughs behind him. Paris startles so badly, he nearly impales himself on his own dagger. Long night, my prince? The guard asks, not bothering to hide his smirk. Paris forces a laugh, just admiring the view. The lie tastes like ashes. Back at camp, Agamemnon is rewriting history already. Tell the scribes to emphasize the omens, he barks at a cowering attendant. And make sure my speech before the last charge sounds noble. The attendant nods, quill scratching frantically. He doesn't mention how Agamemnon had actually been vomiting into a helmet when the Trojans charged. Some truths get buried deeper than corpses. Outside the tent, a group of soldiers pass around a wineskin. One of them, a boy who still can't grow a proper beard, starts singing an off-color song about Helen's golden gates. The others join in, louder with each verse. Their laughter carries across the camp, sharp and bright as broken glass. Somewhere beyond the firelight, A horse startles at the sound. Or maybe it's just the wind. You ever notice how the worst battles always start when the gods are restless? Take last Tuesday. Zeus was sulking because Hera hid his thunderbolts again, so naturally he decided to stir up some drama down on Earth. Next thing you know, Ajax is knee-deep in Trojan intros, screaming about divine inspiration, while Apollo's favorite priest gets his nose bitten off by a particularly enthusiastic Greek recruit. Meanwhile, up on Olympus, past the ambrosia, Ares yawns, scrolling through mortal battle reports on his celestial tablet. Ugh, another chariot charge? These Trojans lack imagination. Athena nearly chokes on her wine. Says the god who thought stampeding elephants was a valid battle tactic last summer. Elephants are classic, Ares mutters, flicking a stray lightning bolt into the mortal realm for fun. Somewhere below, a shepherd's favorite goat explodes into glitter. Down in the Greek camp, you're trying to ignore the fact that your left sandal is definitely talking to you. Not a good sign, mutters the medic, poking your blistered foot with a stick that might have been part of a Trojan child's toy last week. Either you're hallucinating from bad rations, or Dionysus spiked the wine again. You blink. The sandal winks back. Yep, the medic sighs, reaching for the amputation saw. We'll call it divine madness for the records. Over in Troy, Cassandra's having another one of those days. She knows the Greeks are planning something with a giant wooden animal. She knows the council will ignore her. Again. So she does the only logical thing. Starts building her own mini wooden horse out of dinner scraps. See? She snaps when the kitchen staff stare. It's a metaphor. The head cook pats her shoulder. That's nice, dear. Maybe eat some bread. Cassandra hurls a carrot at Priam's favorite tapestry. It sticks right between Hector's embroidered eyes. Back at the beach, the sea nymphs are placing bets. 3 golden shells says Odysseus gets shipwrecked within the month. Giggles one, braiding her hair with stolen Greek arrowheads. Too obvious, yawns another. I'm betting on Agamemnon gets murdered by his own cloak. The tide rolls in, scattering their wagers across the sand. Somewhere beneath the waves, Poseidon grumbles about irresponsible gambling, then promptly loses his temper and capsizes a perfectly innocent fishing boat. You never really notice the dogs until they start howling at midnight. That mangy pack that trails behind the Greek supply carts. Half-wild things with ribs showing and eyes too smart for their own good. They don't belong to anyone, but they know things. Like which soldiers will share their rations, the homesick ones, and which officers beat strays, Agamemnon's lieutenants, always. Last full moon, one of them, a wiry gray brute missing an ear, dragged a Trojan child's doll into camp. Just dropped it at your feet like some twisted peace offering. The doll's yarn hair was matted with mud, one button eye hanging by a thread. You froze, fingers twitching toward your dagger before realizing the dog wasn't threatening you. It just sat there, panting, its tail giving one hesitant thump against the dirt. Get rid of that, your tinmate hissed, making the sign against evil. But you couldn't. Not when you noticed the tiny handprints still visible in the doll's clay face, some Trojan child's fingers pressing into the wet clay before it was fired. You buried it instead, out past the latrines where the ground was soft. The gray dog watched you dig, its ears twitching at every distant shout from the walls of Troy. When you straightened up, wiping sweat from your brow, the dog was gone. But the next morning, you found a single olive pit placed neatly where the doll had been. A trade, maybe, or an apology. Some nights, when the dysentery's bad and the camp smells like death's latrine, the Thessalian recruits start singing. Not war chants, actual shepherd songs from home, the kind their mothers crooned while carding wool. It starts with one cracked voice. Sleep, little lamb, the wolf's gone away. You're sharpening your sword when you hear it. The whetstone slips, nicking your thumb. A bead of blood wells up, but you barely notice. That song, you haven't heard it since you were a boy, curled up by the hearth while your sister spun wool. Across the fire, a young recruit, can't be more than 16, joins in, his voice breaking on the high notes. His hands are shaking around his cup of watered wine. You recognize him from the last skirmish, when he froze mid-charge, his spear trembling like a reed in the wind. Someone had shoved him forward just in time to avoid being trampled. By the third verse, even the Cretan archers, who normally mock anything sentimental, are humming along. The melody weaves through the camp, threading past the snoring drunks and the men playing dice. One of the older soldiers, a grizzled veteran with a scar bisecting his lip, starts tapping his foot. The rhythm matches the distant crash of waves against the shore. Nobody mentions how the lyrics change after "the wolf's gone," how the next lines are about wolves that never leave, about blood in the snow that never washes out. The recruits don't know those verses yet. They'll learn them soon enough. Achilles' men hear it from their tents. They pretend not to. But later, when the fires died down to embers, you catch one of them, a broad-shouldered warrior with Patroclus' name tattooed on his wrist, mouthing the words as he stares at the stars. That scribe from Pylus? The one who always smelled like olive oil and ink? He's dead now. Took an arrow to the lung yesterday during that pointless skirmish by the river. You helped carry his body back. He was lighter than you expected, all scribes are, somehow, as if the weight of the words they carry leaves no room for flesh. His scroll case spilled open on the way, parchment unrolling like a tongue lolling from a dead man's mouth. Here's what nobody's saying. In his tent, under a waterlogged shield, they found 17 letters, all unfinished, all addressed to his sister. The first one starts, "If you're reading this, I've probably done something heroic." The ink is bold, the letters carefully formed. A young man's handwriting, eager to impress. The fifth one says, "The food here is terrible, but at least the wine is worse." There's a wine stain in the shape of a smiley face blotting the corner. The 10th, "I saw a dog today that reminded me of our old hound. It barked at me like it knew I was lying about being brave." The last one just says, "The figs here taste like dust and I miss." The rest is smeared beyond reading. Blood, maybe, or tears, or just the rain that leaks through every tent no matter how many times you patch it. Odysseus pockets them anyway. Says he'll see them delivered. He won't. But it's the kind of lie that keeps men from deserting when the next battle horn sounds. Later, when the camp is quiet, you see him reading them by firelight. His mouth moves silently over the words, as if memorizing them. Just in case, you tell yourself. Just in case he ever makes it back to Pylus. But the next morning, the letters are gone. And Odysseus is smiling again, spinning tales of glory to wide-eyed recruits who don't know any better. The latrine ditch had become a place of dread, though no officer would admit it. You learn to time your visits carefully, always at high noon when the sun burned away the shadows, or during the loudest part of the night watch when the clatter of armor might drown out other sounds. It started with Lycus, yes, but you should have seen the way his hands shook when he told you. Not the normal battle tremors, but something deeper, like his very bones were vibrating. It wasn't just words, he whispered, the campfire casting hollows under his eyes. When it said, "Hector remembers," I felt breath on my neck, like someone leaning close. The next night, 2 Cretan archers got into a fistfight over who had to stand guard nearest the cursed spot. You watched as one, usually the cockiest bastard in Agamemnon's forces, broke down sobbing when assigned the post. "I'll take it," you heard yourself say, surprising everyone, especially yourself. What you didn't tell them, you've been having dreams. Not of Hector, but of his brother Paris, not the golden prince from stories, but a gaunt figure with chapped lips, endlessly whispering numbers against your ear. Trojan casualty counts, maybe, or days until the next attack. When your watch ended at dawn, you found fresh scratches in the dirt, not claw marks, but precise lines forming letters. They spelled Podarchs, your father's name. You pissed on the message until the earth swallowed it whole. Thersites' hands never shook. Even when the siege engines made the ground tremble, his razor moved with unnatural steadiness. Men said he'd learned his trade in the court of Minos, shaving necks before the bull leapers danced. You never asked. Some questions make blades slip. The night you caught him weaving, the air smelled of burnt hair and thyme. He sat cross-legged behind the surgeon's tent, fingers working by moonlight. What you'd mistaken for rope was a grotesque tapestry, hundreds of hair strands forming a pattern that hurt your eyes to follow. See here. Thersites pointed to a patch of silver threads. Odysseus' father died the same day as Priam's eldest grandson. His nail traced a braid of black. Hector's locks, taken after Patroclus dressed him in Greek armor. The pattern pulsed like a living thing. "Balance," he repeated, as if that explained why your own hair stood on end. When they found him dead 3 mornings later, the official story was suicide. Convenient. But you'd seen the way his shears were placed, too neatly, handles aligned northwest, as if pointing toward Troy's weakest gate. And that noose around his wrist? Woven from 3 distinct colors, Trojan brown, Greek gold, and a strand of divine white no mortal could claim. You pocketed the shears. Let the fates find their own damn balance. Pytho's army moved like shadows at dusk. You first noticed their system when the medical tint's linen stores began disappearing, not stolen haphazardly, but taken in precise squares perfect for bandages. The children had developed an entire economy. Scavenged arrowheads became currency, broken spear shafts were repurposed as crutches, and the youngest, though still soft enough to cry, were given guard duty where the generals might toss them scraps. Their model of Troy was terrifying in its accuracy. The Western Gate's weak point? Perfectly recreated using a bent Corinthian helmet. The drainage tunnels Achilles' men had tried to infiltrate last winter? Mapped in miniature with stolen ink and parchment. Watch, Pytho ordered one evening, her voice all cracked porcelain. She launched a clay pebble from their makeshift catapult, a tension strip of stolen bowstring lashed to 2 spear butts. The projectile struck exactly where the real Troy's granary stood. Again, she said, and her troops obeyed with the hollow-eyed efficiency of veterans. That night, you left more than a whetstone. Your best dagger, 3 strips of dried meat, and, after glancing around to ensure no one watched, your mother's carved bone button. Let them melt it down for glue or trade it for favors. The war had taken enough from children already. You found the button returned next morning, threaded onto a leather cord around a toddler's neck. The child couldn't have been more than 4, offered you a solemn nod before scrambling back to fortifications. Somewhere beyond the camp, real Troy's walls stood unbroken. But here, in this dirt and blood nursery, the next generation was already learning how to make them fall.